I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really pleased to be talking to you. I'm going to be talking to you about the treatment of veterans. And I've been treating veterans for 61 years. From all 5 of our recent wars, I have been treating veterans for 61 years. The bad news is that for 58 and a half of those years, I was an abysmal failure. I don't think I was really helpful to a lot of the Vietnam vets, a lot of the Korean vets. You know, it was really strange. I was doing pretty well in my normal practice, working with people and with the same apparent issues, anger issues, alcohol issues, drug abuse issues, relationship issues, all the issues we all deal with as clinicians, but I was not developing any rapport with the vets. Nothing was happening right. The good news is in the last 2.5 years, I have had fantastic success. I mean, people coming up to me and saying, you saved my life. People coming up, spouses coming up and saying, you know, my husband came back from that experience and it changed him completely from what he went through. So, of course, my mission here tonight is to give you some insight into what I was doing wrong for 58 and a half years and what I've learned in the last 2.5 years, how I learned it, and the hope is that you'll get some education to be more effective, especially with post 9/11 combat vets. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. We lose 23 every day for suicides, 23 a day vets commit suicide. That's 8,300 per year. Many more than we've lost in the Iraq War, in the Afghanistan War, and that doesn't even mention all the drug, the alcohol problems, the relationship problems, all of the problems that these vets have. And I was interested, I got in my mail the other day, the APA Books and Video. It's a big book and it lists every book and video that the American Psychological Association is putting out. Not one book, not one video deals with vets. If you look in the index, you won't even find the word vets. That's pretty unbelievable that we could have that many people who are injured walking around crying for help, if they are crying for help, and a lot of people don't know what the hell they're doing. Okay, so I started treating vets at Valley Forge Army Hospital. Not the original Valley Forge in 1778, but in 1954 I was in the Army and I was treating people at the Valley Forge Army Hospital. So I'm going to now talk about why I think I failed for all those years, 58 and a half years. And I tried. You know, I mean, I worked with Vietnam vets and I just never built any rapport and things. And I'm going to tell you why I think the VA fails for a large part. That's going to be part of what I'm going to tell you. Okay, what was my particular failure? So if I was presented with problems, vets would come in with anger problems, relationship problems, depression, anxiety, sleep problems. You know, those are all part of the packages that they come out with. I used the psychological tools that I had been using and successfully for years. Family therapy, medications, cognitive therapy, psychodynamic therapy, even standard trauma techniques using prolonged exposure techniques, cognitive therapy kinds of things, eye movement desensitizations. Those are techniques that had worked for me with like eye sensitive, treated a lot of people with avalanche problems who were afraid to go out in the snow. Prolonged exposure worked very well with people who had children's traumas, traumatized one way or another in children. So, you know, I had a compendium of arms that I could use. None of it worked with the soldiers. I never got close enough to them and they were out the door. And what it reminds me of now in retrospect, why is it that those treatments did not work with those guys or women that came in for treatment? Well, I think that It was that I was dealing with people from a culture that I did not know at all. Early in my career, when I moved to Aspen, I had a couple come in, a Chinese couple that came from mainland China, and they came in with a marriage problem, a marital problem, and they had heard about me or whatever. Sat down with them. I didn't understand one thing about what their marriage was like, their relationship, their expectations from each other, and you know, I knew early on I was not going to be able to help this Chinese couple because I didn't understand their culture or anything about them. Remember that, because that's what I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, about understanding the culture. And if you don't understand the culture of the people you're working with, you're going to be really handicapped. Now, so that was my problem. I was using standard techniques from my armamentarium, and I was using them, and they were ineffectual, and I realized I didn't like the culture, didn't know the culture, and they certainly didn't know the culture that I was coming from. Now, the VA failures, they're a whole different ball of wax. Why did the VA, who was working with veterans and soldiers all this time, why were they failing? Well, you have to know something about that culture, military medicine culture. So I'm going to teach you something about that. Let's take it to the First World War. There was a guy, Feldman, and you have to know that if you're a physician and you're embedded with the front range troops, and soldiers come and say, I can't do this anymore, I'm nervous, I can't sleep, I can't focus, whatever. Their job is not to help that person or treat that person. Their job, and they're committed to, getting them back on the front line. So what Feldman did, I guess that was his name, Feldman, what he did is he strapped them down at a table and he electric shocked them to produce pain. That was his goal. It was so painful for them to get the treatment of this electric shock that they would rather go back into the front lines than stay there and tomorrow get strapped and put into this shock treatment. And he knew damn well what he was doing. He had no illusions that he was doing anything except putting them through torture. So that begins to give you a little bit of the philosophy of formal military medicine. 1954, when I was at Valley Forge Army Hospital, you know, what we were doing was insulin shock therapy. Not so very different. Strapped them down, gave them massive amounts of insulin, put them into a coma. At any rate, the Lancet, years before Lancet's a English medical journal of quite a good reputation, said that insulin shock therapy was not only ineffectual, but it was inhuman. Well, that was in about 52. I was doing this in 54. I was a ward master at Valley Forge Army Hospital. I did it till 56. I don't know what happened after 56, how much longer it went on. But the military mission still goes on that way. They're still trying to get the guys back up on the front line if they're in combat. So they do things like if they're on the front line, they give them antipsychotic or anti-seizure medications. Pills cost a couple pennies each. They give it to them and they try to get them back on the front line. It's just a horrible, horrible system. And then when they get in the back lines, they get into the hospitals, the VA hospitals, and this is a long story, I'm going to tell it very short. They need to do cheap treatment. So if I can diagnose you as post-traumatic stress disorder, I think I have some way of treating that in 6 weeks. If I diagnose you as having a brain injury, it may be 6 months and it's much more complicated and more expensive therapy. So I have personally known a number of doctors who were kicked out of the VA because they were diagnosing too many with traumatic brain injury. And so they were just kicked out. So the military, I mean, they do some really wonderful things, and maybe I'll get a chance to talk about those also. But I can tell you that what happens in the military is not good, and I was a terrific failure trying to do the best thing. But the Army uses archaic, unproven, inhuman treatment modalities like the insulin shock therapy, and then the VA has other ways of not treating them very well, like long waiting lists, inappropriate therapists. Lorna was talking to you about you have to be prepared and you have to be trained. I brought an article, for some of you, I brought about 5 of them. After post-traumatic stress disorder, more trauma. And this is written by a captain who served in Afghanistan, came back, and it tells his trials and tribulations of trying to get treatment at the VA hospital. So I leave that there, and it's by a guy by the name of Morris. So that's enough about what the VA doesn't do. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what I did learn. Remember I told you I have had all this success, what I learned and how I learned it, because I'm going to suggest that you guys can learn it too. So I'm going to give you the resources, and I'm going to talk you through the various things. What happened to me was I got in touch with Paul Anderson, Lou's husband, and we were planning to take vets into the woods. I'll talk you through these things and refer it. But I had to prepare. I was going to be with vets, and we were going to take them up in the wilderness. Paul's idea is wilderness therapy. We're going to take them together as a group. We're going to take them up in the mountains. We're going to read philosophy. We're going to talk to them about Shakespeare. We're going to do daily hikes. We're going to teach them the beauties of nature. And I was going to be the psychologist that went along. These were all combat vets. All had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. All of them had problems, brain damage problems. We had amputees. And I was going to go out in the woods and spend a few days with these guys, so I wanted to prepare. And I knew that what I had done in the past had not been very good. So what did I do? Well, the first thing I did is I started reading books by returning vets. I wasn't reading what the VA was preparing or my professional organizations were preparing. I started reading books from returning vets who had gone through as an attempt to learn about their culture. And you'll see on the top of your list, I've listed there are now dozens of them. Some are so hard to read. There's one called The Outpost, which talks about stupid officers putting people in harm's way, having no concept of what they were doing, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of them. But I wrote down there 2 for you that I thought were the most important. One is called Redeployment by Phil Clay. This book was listed as #1 seller, the best book of 2014. And it really is a good book. It's a collection of short stories, actually, by this guy, hitting various aspects. Each chapter talks about a different aspect of what they went through being deployed and deployed and deployed and deployed. That's very good. There's another one that I like very much, which is very readable. Thank You for Your Service by David Finkel. They're both listed on there. So if I was going to pick, and I did think about what I might bring to you guys, those 2 books, if you read those 2 books, or just tasted those 2 books, go on Amazon, you can get them for a couple of bucks. So those are the books that I think you can read, and that helps. There's another thing you can do. Online courses. All these courses are free. It started with me. I'm doing some studies with various vet groups, and I'm working through various universities. And so for me to be a co-investigator, I used to be a director of research at a medical school. None of that counts. I had to take courses in order to work with the university. It was kind of fun. And I took some courses on doing research with human subjects, how you get releases of information, what you have to inform them of, the risks, the benefits, that they could quit the research anytime. At any rate, I started taking online courses, and they were so good. I'm telling you, people, they have developed a science for doing online courses that is different than at least I imagined they were going to be. These courses, they're all divided into modules. You read a module, and then you take a test on that module. And if you get things wrong, you can't just look up what is right. They send you back to a thing where you have to read and understand the concept, and then you're retested. In other words, you can't cheat on these courses, and you're forced to learn, and I was really impressed with those. And so online courses can teach you things like, remember I said the importance of the military culture. I'll talk more about that, but if you don't understand the military culture, these people can't talk to you. So I've listed some courses under the B on that sheet, free online courses. There's one specifically for mental health professionals that's going to teach you what the rank is, how they respond to things, what they're taught. You get a pair. If I had had an online course like that for my Chinese couple, I might have been able to do something. So I really encourage you. They're free courses. You can quit anytime. And I've listed for you a couple of places where you can get these courses. I really recommend the one on understanding military culture, from the war zone to the home front. And then they have a couple of courses that are specific to various presenting symptoms that you're liable to see. So you need to educate yourself. It was very much like what Lorna was saying. Take some courses. You know, don't think that because you're a mental health professional, you could treat anybody in any way, shape, or form. Their depressions, their anxieties, their angers are different, and you need to understand them. Okay, now the most potent of all the things that I did to prepare myself to work with vets and have outstanding success was being on the Huts for Vets trips. Because what we did is we met with the vets, they came to a house, we had a dinner with them, and then we had our board, the Huts for Vets board, all of whom are vets. We have Marine vets, sergeants that were breaking down doors, we have ex-colonels from the Vietnam War, from the Afghan War, from every war. I'm the oldest, I go back to Korea, but we have people from all these wars on the board, and we would tell our stories, how hard it was to come back. Now some of us, it's easy. Second World War, you were a hero. You come back from Vietnam and you were getting double fingers, and accused of being baby killers and things like that. So everybody had, from different eras, stories to tell where they told what happened to their marriages when they came back. So that was our board telling stories. And then we would go around the circle, and these guys that we had picked, and they were all, as I said, post-traumatic stress guys, and various kinds of, then they would tell their stories, and that kind of like broke the ice. Then we took them up in the mountains for 2.5 days. We hiked with them, we read with them, we sat around tables, we had fires with them, and magic happened. These guys would tell all kinds of stories about what they had went through, and they opened up more and more and more, and I began to learn the magic. The magic is peer group. It's not having a terrific person like me with billions of years of experience, even being in the center. None of that makes any difference. They had to know that the guy sitting next to them went through the same shit that they went through, that they really understood what it was like. I'm going to tell you 3 little stories. The last one is too horrific to even tell, but so I'm going to ease you into it. First story, sitting around a fire, and the conversation had kind of died down. So I was interested in just asking some questions of them, like, what do you guys think about drones? And there were 10, 12 guys sitting around the fire, and I had my expectations of what I was going to hear. I was going to hear, great, let those things go in and blow up people, and I don't have to do it. That was my expectation, which seemed reasonable. To a man, they hated the drones. And why? This is something that doesn't put you in harm's way. Why would you hate the drones? They said, there's no honor in that. Somebody sitting in an office, running a computer, and going over and killing people is if he's in an airplane and he's piloting a plane and he can be killed, there's honor in that. And that was just the beginning of my introduction to what they feel about honor. They may hate the service, they may hate their officers, they may hate a lot of things, but they believe in themselves in a certain way, especially we're going to talk about in a few minutes about warriors and the warrior culture. That was a gentle introduction to me. I got what they were saying right away. They elaborated on it. Then they started telling stories that weren't so just philosophical. I'll tell you the first story. First story, because I'm easing you into this. A guy goes out on parole and he finds a bunch of people. He's not sure if they're good guys or bad guys. He rounds them up, he takes them back to headquarters, and then the question is, interrogate them, find them out whether they're good guys and bad guys. So that happened a number of times. This is Adam. And Adam would take them back to interrogation. They would be released. And 6 days later, he would run into the same people, sometimes with guns, shooting at them. So his orders were to round up people and take them back for interrogation. Guess what he did after the third time? Well, you don't have to guess. Nobody got back to interrogation. If they were at all suspect, they were killed. So that becomes a little more horrific of a story. But I'm telling you, I'm really hesitant to tell you this third story that I'm going to.
You don't need to.
Third story happened many times. I mean, I could tell it in various, but here's the amazing part of it, and I know you're not going to understand this. Guys are sitting around, some guy is telling a story. What he had to do was he had to pick up a general somewhere and take, a mayor, and take this mayor from one town to another, but that didn't work out. He ended up confronting some people in a road. They were all armed, didn't know who they were. At any rate, the story ends up, they decided to blow them away, and they killed a lot of civilians. Now, when they were telling the story about that they made the mistake, and they didn't know whether these were friends or foes and this kind of thing, and they just blew them away. What do you think the other veterans were doing listening to the story? Now, we were around a table, we were drinking beer, singing songs. They laughed their heads off. And I was sitting there watching people talking about killing civilians, and these guys are laughing their heads off, are telling the story, and then the next guy would tell his story, which would be horrendous, maybe coming across a child and not knowing whether the child was dangerous or not, and killing it. And it gets worse. Then you hear stories about them going out in the evening for fun and killing civilians. Now, how does that happen? How does somebody who was a patriot and joined right after 9/11 to fight for his country turn in to somebody who finds pleasure and fun in killing people? The movie now, Sniper, touches on that a little bit, about they're all bad people and I'm going to kill as many as I can kill and all of that kind of thing. So I'm not going to attempt to explain the laughter and how it is, but I can tell you that those soldiers coalesced, felt good about each other, said things like, I'm closer to you than I was to anybody in my combat outfit, and there's a dynamic for that too. They didn't have to worry about them being blown up. They could be friends and take care of their back. So I learned a lot about the vets and who they were and what those stories were, that those Vietnam vets, when I was treated, they never told me any stories about what had happened to them in combat. They came in with their anger or their drinking problem or something, and I didn't get to know them. I got to know what went on with all these guys, but it wasn't that I got to know them. They were telling the stories and sharing them with their brothers that they could share the stories with. I don't want you to think that these were all morally corrupt, ruined human beings that had no compassion for the human condition, because they did. I mean, I also learned on those trips that these guys were brave, that if you gave them a mission, they would do anything. If you got hurt, they would carry you out. It was a closer bond that we formed in 3 days with these guys that they had with their wives, their children, because they could relate. They felt they were in a safe place where they could relate and they could talk about. And I learned all kinds of positive things about them. I'm not going to take the time to. Okay, so now I'm switching topics from what I learned from being in the mountains with them, and I'm going to get back to that in terms of how you use peer groups to help these people. That's going to be the message that I'm going to come around to. But I want to tell you about one other person, and he has 2 books that are listed on that paper that I gave you. It's Dr. Edward Tick. He's written 2 books, and they're listed there: War and the Soul, and The Warrior's Return, Restoring the Soul After the War. This man, he's only been treating vets for 35 years. He's kind of like a newcomer. I was 61. But he's worked mostly with, let me tell you a little bit about Tick. He works mostly with Vietnam vets. And he does some wonderful, wonderful things. He takes them back to Vietnam. He introduces them to the people that had been their enemies. You have to come to terms with the people that you killed and the people that you ran over. But he's very much a Jungian. And I'm gonna teach you some of his basic concepts. But he thinks that the warrior is an archetype. An archetype comes from Plato's pure forms. Jung believes that we have, at an unconscious and conscious level, a whole lot of archetypes. What is the good mother? We have an idea. What's the good mother? What's the good father? Males have animus. What is the perfect woman? There's a lot of archetypes, and it says in our conscious and unconscious, we have concepts of what these archetypes are. What is a mother supposed to be? What is a father supposed to be? Well, one of the archetypes that Jung through Tick talks about is the warrior. And I'm now going to teach you what he thinks about the warrior. And I'm teaching it because I think it's extremely valuable. The invisible wound that today we call post-traumatic stress disorder is not a failure of character or a mental illness. It's been known as long as there have been warriors. It is an honorable and inevitable wound. And he also thinks it can be a portal to transformation and a school for wisdom. So he's talking about the spiritual wounding that happens to these warriors, and he thinks it's ubiquitous. He doesn't use, for instance, the term post-traumatic stress disorder. He will use post-traumatic stress, but he will not call it a disorder. He calls it soldier's heart. Let's see. So the warrior is an archetype. War is omnipresent and part of every culture in history. Every culture has a concept of warriors. And then he in his books go through the ancient Greek wars, through all history's wars, and describes how warriors were thought of in different cultures. There's 80 names for what we call post-traumatic stress through the years. I'm not going to read them all. Post-traumatic stress disorder came out in 1980. That's when we started using that term. But you've heard of things like soldier's heart, shell-shocked, combat fatigue. All of those describe the same thing. Tick calls it a soul wound. Now, I had trouble with the word soul. Some of you will have trouble with that word. Others of you will not. But I'm telling you, if you read Tick, you will finally decide soul is exactly the right word. I thought I was going to try to transfer or translate soul for you into some, one's worth, one's goodness, one's humanity, one's essence. But what is really true is that these warriors, they need to have their soul redone, because what they were taught, they were turned into killers. And if you watch The American Sniper, with no compassion. So if you're a killer and you have no compassion, then killing ragheads or children or families, it becomes very easy. But then what happens is these vets look at themselves and they don't recognize themselves. They don't know who they are. The worst stories I heard were the guys that went over to Afghanistan. No, I think it was Vietnam. wherever it was, Iraq, I guess it was Iraq. And they were happy. They all joined as patriots. It was 9/11, and they went to fight for their country, and they went over there, and after they saw what they were doing to that culture and to those people, they came to the thing, we're the bad guys. I always thought of myself as the good guys. We're coming to rescue people. We're coming to help people. And if you sit there and you see you're destroying a culture and you're killing civilians, and they don't want you there, and they think of you as invaders, it is a very hard thing to adapt into your sense of who you are, to say, I'm one of the bad guys. And what that does to you, if you believe you're a bad guy and you have a lot of, it's just a terrible thing. They end up hating who they become. They don't tell others. They're ashamed of it. That's why in that circle, when we bring them together, they can talk about what they did, and it can be shared, and it can be laughed at, and we'll get to that maybe later. But the only ones that they don't trust a therapist who's never been in combat, who never killed a child, who doesn't know how they eroded from feeling proud of what they did to hating what they did. Most of these guys come out of the service, they hate war, they wouldn't join war. When we go up into the mountains, they talk, they're all peaceniks, you know, except for there are a few that are so maladapted to society that they're in, is they want to go back. And so they want to put themselves in harm's way, because there they know what their mission is, there they know what they're doing. I mean, it's just a tragedy kind of things. But at any rate, you can learn to do that. Okay, I'm going to talk about one other thing about this culture, and then I'm almost done. So in Tick's book, he talks about Vietnam. And he talks about, in Vietnam, we lost 58,000 soldiers. It was a terrible war. We lost 58,000. The Vietnamese lost 3 million. And I'm not talking about wounded. And we destroyed their infrastructure. And we did a lot of other things. So 3 million were killed. A lot of those were civilians. Now, after the war, there's psychiatrists over there working with them. And they didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder. Every Vietnam soldier that I saw, and up until today, they are still suffering with what we'll call post-traumatic stress, or soldier's heart, or suffering from all these things, but not the Vietnam soldiers. And after 1970, and I can tell you after 1970, a lot of Vietnam soldiers are still suffering. But in Vietnam, couldn't find one post-traumatic stress disorder among their soldiers. Why, asks Tick. Well, they thought of their warriors as heroes, defending their homeland. They approved of their conduct. They saw that everything that their warriors did were moral in defending their homeland. Even when they did some pretty terrible things, they understood it. So those warriors came home from battle, and they were embraced and thanked and felt, you know, you were wonderful people, and we honor and we respect you. That's very different from Dan Glidden, who was a Vietnam soldier on our board, who comes back and says he was given this, and he was told, you baby killers. They were not treated very well. So that's just like a little introduction to the idea that how the culture brings these warriors back and how we view them is really, really very important. Okay. So, you know, getting back to the point, how were we able to help the veterans that we helped? And we're helping a lot of them. We're running 6 vet trips. We're expanding in all kinds of directions. Huts for Vets has money now to send vets to school. We're doing many, many things beyond taking the vets up. We have money if they can't afford not only school, but if they need a ramp in their house or something like that. Because what people are willing to do, they may not understand who these vets are, but they know that something bad has happened, and so people are giving us money and money and money. So our coffers are full. We're running 6 vets trips this year, and you know, some for women, some for men. and I'm going down to colleges to teach people how to train mental health people to work with vets. We're doing a lot of different things. But what can you do to successfully treat vets and know? And the procedural steps are just exactly what I said. I'm just about done. You ought to read books by returning vets. Read about the horrors that they went through. Read those books, that will educate you. Certainly read Edward Tick's books. You may not agree with everything he says. I don't agree with some of the things. He does dances with drums with them. He has them drum and dance, and he tries to imitate what other cultures have done with their warriors, what the American Indians did, what the Greeks did. He goes through history and he tries to adapt those, and he takes some to reunite with the people in Vietnam. He does a lot of things, but what I think he does that's best, and what I'm here to underline in terms of treating vets, is don't try to treat them by yourself. I don't care how many books you read. I don't care how many you know. I still, to this day, would not take an individual vet in. I would have a partner. And my partner would be a vet who had gone through the same combat. If I could get them in a peer group and get a peer group going of it, I could let them lead the peer group. So you stay in the background and you make sure that they have someone to talk to. I have another set of articles here about somebody complaining, well, the guy who complained about the VA that I told you about. He thought the VA finally came up with a program, and it was a program where they brought a group of vets in and they did something that they thought was cognitive therapy, a form of cognitive therapy. As I read the description, it wasn't cognitive therapy. It was a peer group meeting together and talking about their experiences and learning from each other. In the finest sense of the term, it was a support group. So don't try to treat vets by yourself. Get them in a peer group. Find it. There are vets now, and we have some, who are really very good at bringing vets who are very isolated into groups very slowly. They know how to talk to them. They kick down drawers, and they did the same terrible things that they would. They know the culture. So read vet books, study Edward Tick, because what he says about the warrior archetype is delicious and use. Learn military culture. Don't go in and not know the difference between a captain, a lieutenant colonel, or you just need to know all the things. They love their uniforms, they love their weapons. You have to learn something and then treat them in peer groups or team up with combat vets as co-therapists. That's the end of my formal talk. Now I can tell you much more about Huts for Vets and how we do all these things, but I don't want to take up the time. We can do that at a different time. If there's any questions and answers, I'm going to stay around and I'll answer things for you. But in essence, that's what I want to do.